Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. We're on the module Unit 2, Block 2 of A225, Confidence and Crisis, 1840 to 1880, edited by Don Loftus. One Religion, Revival and Reform, page 202. Got a highlighting pen, if anything significant. Much other educated opinion was not sure. Some newspapers were sceptical about the revival and gleefully reported cases of fraudulent manifestations. Many clergymen were distressed by the physical manifestations and disliked the way the revival seemed to subvert what they felt were divinely ordained church structures. London based medical opinion was especially critical, arguing that the physical manifestation were diseased, hysteria, and that they could lead to permanent insanity. Indeed, many members of the medical and religious professions thought the revival was a dangerous delusion and worried about the impact it would have on religious and social order. If we go to the website, we look at the revival of 1859 and its critics. While it is not up to historians to decide which interpretation of the revival is right, it's important to remember that for many people in the mid 19th century, Ulster, the revival, and its physical features were a popular, if temporary, way for them to express their religious feelings, as a late Victorian obsession with senses and spiritualism showed. And as the early 20th century explosion in Pentecostal Christianity, it demonstrated people in so called modern and rational societies still seek genuine spiritual experiences. The problem in the mid 19th century was how this new religious enthusiasm could be accommodated within existing denominational structures. Converts were keen to prioritise the growth aspects of congregational membership, such as evangelism, Sunday schools, and philanthropy. But there were others who, in the spirit of Isaac Nelson, 1809 1888, a Belfast based Presbyterian minister, who was publicly critical of the revival, it felt that their faith was best demonstrated by a quiet commitment to the traditions of the church. At times, schism was the result. Two groups seeking a deeper spiritual life splintered off from the Church of England, and Methodism fractured more than 7 times, unable to manage the tension between religious vitality and denominational control. By the end of the century, however, Victorian religious life had become increasingly formal, with church attendance on the decline of secularization, in blunting the hard edges of theological differences. The new watchwords for British denominations become reunion and reunification. The publication of essays and reviews in 1860. If we consider the papal aggression to be example of a sectarian controversy, and it also revival to be a controversy over method and style, then the debate that arose over the publication of essays and reviews of 1860 should be considered a controversy over theology. In particular, it should be seen as a controversy over theology in the Church of England. Essays and reviews provoked an extensive public discussion about the Bible and how it could be studied and understood. It also reflected changing ideas about the role of the state church and the beliefs it should or should not represent. Essays and Review was a work of 7 authors, 6 clergymen, 1 layman, and all their Anglicans. They were all broad church intellectuals and scholars who had been influenced by German biblical scholarship and by liberal theological ideas, and wanted to bring these new interpretations to a wider audience. It is hard to see from an examination of the book table of contents just what all the fuss was about. But the articles were deeply controversial. Roland Williams, 1817 to 1870, critiqued the prophecies in the Old Testament. Baden Powell, 1796 to 1860, denied the possibility of miracles. Henry Wilson, 1803 to 1888, questioned the doctrine of eternal punishment. Benjamin Jowett, 1817 to 1893, argued that the Bible should be subject to literature and critical analysis and should be read like any other book. These ideas, although arguably not new, caused an enormous furore. Coming off the back of the controversial publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859. The collection went through 13 editions under 5 years and provoked at least 400 published responses, most of them negative. Parsons, 1988, page 41. The book was condemned by the Anglican Church, Hierarchy, and two of the authors, Williams and Wilson, were charged with heresy because of their views. In 1862, the highest court in the Anglican Church found them guilty, but in 1864, they appealed for their case to be heard by the Privy Council, a secular court that had been the authority to rule on religious cases. The Privy Council interpreted its role as not to decide which position was right, but to decide whether or not the views of ecclesiastics had stepped beyond a reasonable interpretation of the Anglican Church's doctrinal statement. The 39 articles, after some consideration, agreed that they had not, and overturned Williams and Wilson's convictions. If we turn to 11.5, Benjamin Jowett on the interpretation of Scripture, Frederick Harrison, Neo-Christianity 1860, located at the end of the unit. Reading 11.15 is an extract from the syllabic and academic Jowett's contribution to Essay and Reviews. Reading 11.6, a critical response by the writer and philosopher Frederick Harrison, first published in the Westminster Review. Complex theological issues are discussed in these articles, extracts, so just try to get a general impression of the argument and then try to answer the following questions. What is Jowett's suggestion is wrong with the way the Bible is currently interpreted? What does Harrison find so objectionable about essays and reviews? He does not say it very clearly, but Jowett suggests that bad arguments, failed prophecies, and other inconsistencies in names and dates are simply ignored by contemporary biblical scholars. He suggests that this is because it is seen to be a holy book and it is not treated as rigorously as other academic texts or subjects, such as mathematics. Harrison argues that the atheists are trying to graft a new reasoning, a philosophy of rationalism, onto the foundation of popular Christianity, and that this is not workable. If the public accept that the Bible is full of errors, they will never continue to venerate it as the book of life. Harrison feared that a critic of the Bible, it would stop people reading it altogether, thus bring Christianity into disrepute. The atheists, however, claimed that a more critical approach to the Bible would make it more credible and authoritative. Jowett argued that the failure to discuss contradictions and fallacies in the Bible meant ordinary people no longer saw it as a credible text. This controversy reveals challenge that liberal theology was starting to present a traditional orthodoxy. Opponents objected not only to the collection's liberal theology, they also disliked its tone, which they found unnecessarily negative, and the fact that it seemed to be directed towards the general public with a view to publicising these ideas more widely. Nevertheless, by the 1880s and 1890s, the biblical critical methods that the essayists endorsed had been, in more moderate form, quietly integrated into orthodox position. The Essay and Review's controversy also revealed the changing attitudes of the secular state of the Church of England. From Privy Council decision made clear that the state was not willing to endorse one theological party within the church at the expense of another. As Anthony Lentin points out, it was reluctant to penalise intellectual integrity and honest difference of opinion in Lentin 1988. Instead, by its rulings over essays and reviews and other disputes, it forced the Church to tolerate the existence of different theological opinions within its ranks. For Gerald Parsons, the Church's position at this stage was at best ambiguous, at worst, a downright muddle. That religious issues should not have provoked such intense public debate is a sign that religion was important and how it was practiced really matters. It is also a sign that, despite the shared Christian heritage, there were wrong and growing differences between denominations and theology worldviews. The papal aggression and the essays and the reviews, the controversies and fairly clear-cut cases where the forces of tradition and orthodoxy, although partly successful, were obliged to give way to new ideas of toleration and exclusivity. The Ulster revival is a more complicated case, but it too can be interpreted as a clash between old and new worldviews, and between authoritarian and more democratic visions of religion. Opponents of the revival, including representatives of the new science, articulated what we might call a more modern antipathy towards emotional excess of the growing Victorian fashion for more formal, liturgical and restrained forms of religious expression. To 11.4, toleration, pluralism and a state. As you have seen in Unit 6, in the early 19th century, the British government had already begun to adjust its relationship to the Church of England and started to extend a measure of toleration towards its religious minorities. In Scotland, where over 90% of the population was Presbyterian, toleration was not really an issue. In Ireland, toleration for Presbyterian and Catholic communities had long been a source of contention. Starting in the 18th century, a series of Catholic Relief Acts were passed and Catholic emancipation was granted in 1829. Catholic demands for reform in the years thereafter, and as a result of a popular tariff war, when Irish Catholics refused to pay their church rates, meant that the government was obliged to substantially reduce the size and scale of the Church of Ireland and eventually to abolish tariff payments. In 1869, further pressure from Irish nationalists forced the government to disestablish the Church of Ireland, passing laws which removed its privileged status and placed it on the same footing as all the other Irish denominations. In England and Wales, nonconformists were also making demands for the reform of their grievances since the 1660s. They too had been subject to a range of discriminatory legislation, in particular the Test and Cooperation Acts, which restricted civil and government jobs to members of the Anglican Church, started in the early 19th century. The government also began to grant them a measure of toleration. 1812, a new Toleration Act was passed that confirmed nonconformists' freedom of worship and laid out new rules for the regulation of their ministers and meeting houses. 1828, the Test and Cooperation Acts were replaced. Historians agreed that these legislative decisions were highly significant. They showed that the government was willing to adjust its relationship to the Church of England in order to accommodate new ideas and circumstances. For David Thompson, this represented a vital breach in the principle of the Anglican Constitution in Thompson 1972, page 22. For Gerald Parsons, it was a constitutional recognition of religious pluralism, Parsons 1988, page 57. Now Catholics and nonconformists, as well as Anglicans, could participate fully in the life of the British state. I'd like to spend the rest of this unit looking at how, in the mid-19th century, it was nonconformists who made the strongest case for further reform. Nonconformists believed that a state should not interfere with religion and there should not be no state church. Religious practice should be voluntary. Everyone was agreed that the established churches no longer represented the entire population and accepted that they never would do so. How, therefore, would the reality of religious diversity be accommodated? This was a question that was much debated in the middle years of the 19th century. Nonconformists were some of the leading voices raised in opposition to the current system. While they were obviously motivated by their own interest, they based their arguments on wider notions of what they called religious equality. This meant that equal treatment by the state of all citizens, irrespective of their religious convictions. Larson, 1999, page 110, their action brought about significant changes to the constitutional basis of British society and contributed to its emergence as a modern pluralist state. The Whig reforms of 1830s, the Reform Act of 1832 and the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835, which enabled nonconformists to take up position in local government. It gave nonconformists a new degree of political power, especially in new urban centres such as Birmingham, Manchester and Sheffield. They used this influence to address what they called practical grievances. The many small laws that were still in force and that discriminated against those outside the Anglican Church. If we read the 6 practical grievances of the Protestant dissenting deputies drafted in 1833 and set out below, the deputies were a group of leading nonconformists set up in 1732 to protect nonconformist religious rights in and around London. They were highly respectable and had done much to protect nonconformists from unwarranted infringement on their religious freedom. The practical grievances of the Protestant dissenting deputies, 15th of March 1833. Compulsory conformity to the prayer book in marriage. The want of legal registration of dissenters, births and deaths, liability to church rates and other ecclesiastical demands, alleged liability of places of worship to poor rates, denial of the right of burial by their own ministers in parochial churchyards, virtual exclusion from the benefits of Oxford and Cambridge. What do these grievances tell us about the Church of England and its existing relationship with the state? Why do you think these practices were seen as grievance by nonconformists? The Church of England was closely caught up in the workings of the state at a local and personal level. All life events, such as births and marriages, were regulated by them. The church was financially privileged. Everyone had to pay for its upkeep. Membership of the church conveyed special privileges, such as being able to attend university. I think nonconformists must have felt very frustrated by these requirements to use Anglican Church or support it financially. They must have felt excluded from activities, that they were reserved only for Anglicans. They have felt angry at being forced to conduct important life events, such as burials, using a form of religion that they did not accept. Even though many of these grievances were quite small and had only a minimal impact of nonconformists' everyday lives, Larson has shown it was a social stigma attached to them that really ranked. They obliged nonconformists to subject themselves to rituals and forms of words to which they did not subscribe, and they had to do this at sensitive and significant points in their lives, such as when they were getting married or on the death of a loved one. Over the course of the 1830s and 1840s, these grievances become a focal point for nonconformist political agitation. Nonconformists argued that these laws were unfair and that they obliged people to act against their consciences. Some of these grievances were quickly addressed. Most political opinion was agreed that there ought to be civil registration process for births and marriages, and this was introduced by Parliament in 1836 in England and Wales, 1845 in Ireland, and 1853 in Scotland. The religious tests that had prevented non-Anglicanism from attending Oxford and Cambridge universities were placed in 1854 and 56, respectively. Other grievances struck closer at the heart of the church-state relationship and were fiercely contested for many decades. Church rates, for example, were abolished only in 1868, after almost a decade of intense political action. The most contentious of all these grievances was the issue of burial according to the common law of England. Everyone had a right to be buried in a local parish churchyard, the burial ground attached to the parish church. The only expectations to this were those who had died unbaptized, who had committed suicide, or had been excommunicated from the church. Ecclesiastical law stated that this ground was concentrated and that only an Anglican clergyman using the Anglican burial service could perform the funeral. In the early 18th century, there had been cases of Anglican clergy refusing to bury nonconformists, claiming that their baptism were not valid. But the courts in the early century had confirmed that nonconformist baptisms were indeed Christian and were therefore valid. Anglican clergy who refused to bury properly baptized nonconformists in the early 19th century were routinely reprimanded by their bishops. Part of the reason for this debate was the general lack of suitable burying grounds. By the 1850s, this situation had reached crisis point, and new legislation was passed that forced old churchyards to close and enabled new public and private cemeteries to be opened. These were obliged to contain consecrated ground for Anglicans and unconsecrated ground for everyone else. These new burial grounds made it possible for nonconformists to be buried there. And in the crisis, where these cemeteries were located, church, chapel, conflict over burial largely ceased, but in burial areas where the only legal place of burial was a churchyard, conflicts between Anglicans and nonconformists continued. Turn to 1117. The Colton burial place, 1864, located at the end of the unit. This is an account of the burial of John Pavey, a Unitarian living in the parish of Colton, Devon, published in a national newspaper, the Daily News, on the 3rd of November 1864. Note that this article is reproduced from another newspaper, Nonconformist, the leading voice for political nonconformity. As you read, consider the following questions. How does this burial demonstrate the grievances that nonconformists were complaining about? What does the Anglican clergyman, the Rev. Guret, say in his defence? John Pavey is described as a respectable, godly man, yet the Rev. Guret's actions seem offensive, and disrespectful. He makes the family provide him with documentary evidence of Pavey's baptism. Guret's refusal to conduct the burial meant that the Rev. McComb had to do it, but standing in the lane outside the churchyard itself, this must have been hurtful and distressing to the family, their friends, and the wider nonconformist community. Guret acknowledges that Pavey's family had the right to bury their relative in the Colton churchyard. However, because of Pavey's Unitarian beliefs, Guret says he could not conscientiously read the burial service over him. The Colton burial case illustrates quite neatly that the rival issues at stake. Reading 11.7 makes it clear that nonconformists expected Anglican clergy to fulfil their legal duty and burial a person as long as they had been legitimately baptized. Guret's actions were probably motivated by high church views. It demonstrates the difficulties clergymen with sensitive consciences could have in effecting their duty as, in essence, officers of the state. No one was really happy with the way this aspect of the church-state relationship was working. Starting in 1861, nonconformists began to mount a sustained campaign for the reform of the burial laws, although they had considerable support from a wide range of political opinion. Their proposals were regularly defeated in Parliament by a furious group of conservatives who felt that any changes would be terrible assault on a church position. It was only 1880 that a Burial Act was passed that allowed clergymen of any Christian faith to conduct a burial using their own service in Anglican churches. The campaign to redress practice grievances was coordinated by a group called the Libertarian Society. Had been formed in 1844 as an anti-state church society, which reflected nonconformist commitment to another aspect of religious equality, complete separation of church and state, or complete disestablishment of the Church of England. Nonconformists were religious voluntarists. They believed that churches should not be supported by the state, but by voluntary or private effort. They admired the example of the USA, where each denomination had to support itself. Their campaign for liberation was led by Edward Myle, 1809 to 1881, a former Congregationalist minister turned journalist and politician. While a consistently militant voice, Myle highlighted the injustice of a national church, with its wealth and resources benefiting only a proportion of the population. And now this relationship prevented the church itself from exercising its theological freedom. However, public support for disestablishment fluctuated. It was strong in the 1830s and rose again in the late 1860s, when the Liberals disestablished the Church of Ireland, while nonconformist grievances led the eventual disestablishment of the Church of Wales in 1941. The status of the Church of England was never under serious threat. As Deborah Wiggins pointed out in a study of the Burial Act of 1880, by giving way on the practical grievances, the Anglican Church may well have saved itself. It certainly silenced its most powerful and folky furious enemies. Wiggins, 1966. In this way, a delicate equipoise was just about maintained. I hope you can see now the important religion in the mid-19th century in Britain and Ireland. At least half the population attended a place of worship on a Sunday, and religious ideas and practice were widely debated and discussed. Expansionist movements of religious vitality, evangelicalism, Catholicism, and honest doubt generated considerable activity and reform. This enthusiasm, however, also provoked conflict with older traditional interests, and while these seem to prevail, at least in part, it is possible to see the signs of new and different ideas coming through. Throughout this period, the British state implemented laws that laid the foundations of modern religious equality. Sometimes this was forced on them by political necessity, as was the case often in Ireland. But at other times it was because it was less and less willing to govern in this area of individual belief and conscience. As the century progressed, the challenge would be for all the denominations, including the Church of England, to function with this new tolerant environment and to stave off what many saw as corrosive influence of modernity and secularization.